Alright guys, in the last lesson, we came across this concept of scope very briefly, and I promised that I'd go through it in this lesson. So here we are. Now, scope is a really important concept in all kinds of programming, and not just JavaScript programming, but it works a little bit differently from language to language. So in this lesson, I'm going to be focusing specifically on JavaScript and all of the ways in which JavaScript tackles this concept of scope. So what exactly is this concept of scope anyways? So let's say that we've created a function called a, and inside the function we create a new variable called x, and we set it to equal 2. Now, if I try to console log x inside function a, then of course there's no problems and I would get 2 printed in my console. Now, creating our variable inside a function is kind of equivalent to having an apple tree inside your backyard, right? Your house is surrounded by walls and you've got this apple tree that's inside your garden, and you go ahead and you go and pick from your apple tree. Well, this is of course possible. So our code, in this case, when we're using this variable x inside the function where we created the variable x, is of course possible. Now let's look at another scenario. Let's say that you create your variable x inside your function a, but you try to access it outside the function. Well, this is not going to work, because this is equivalent to your neighbor trying to pick the apples from your apple tree in your garden. There's a brick wall that blocks him from accessing your garden. And this is where scope comes in. The scope of variable x is local to function a. It's only accessible inside the function a. So you can change it, you can use it, you can manipulate it, do anything you will with variable x inside the curly braces of function a, but you cannot access it outside those curly braces. Now, this also holds true in a third scenario. Say you have two functions, a and b. You create the variable x inside function a, and you try to use it inside function b. Well, that's not going to work either, right? Because this is like your neighbor standing in his backyard trying to access the apples in your backyard. That's never going to work. So again, in this case, the scope of variable x is limited to inside the curly braces of function a. Now, these are called local variables, and the scope of local variables are local to where they were declared. So in most cases, that's inside the curly braces of a function. Now, here's another scenario. What if instead of creating variable x inside function a, we create it outside the function? So when we write var x, the keyword var states that we're creating this new variable x, and it's created outside the curly braces of any functions. Well, in this case, not only can you use it inside function a, you can also use it anywhere else inside the code file. And this is equivalent to an apple tree that's growing in the neighborhood. So not only can you, the person who lives in a house in the neighborhood, pick apples from the apple tree, but your neighbor who lives in a different house can also pick the public apple tree in the neighborhood. So these are known as global variables. Now, there's a few peculiarities about JavaScript variables in relation to scope, and I just want to quickly talk about it. Now, if instead of creating our var inside a function, which you can view as, say, a brick wall that's impenetrable, if we instead created it inside an if statement, or a for loop, or a while loop, or anything other than a function, basically, then this is kind of seen as a soft wall, like a hedgerow. And when you do that, you can in fact access this var x outside the curly braces of the if block, or the for loop, or the else block, and it's the equivalent of having your neighbor sort of just sneakily going through your hedgerow and stealing your apples. This is completely possible using vars inside JavaScript. So this brings us nicely to some other types of variables that we saw previously. So we've seen that you can create a variable by using the var keyword, the let keyword, as well as the const keyword, but they have slightly different behavior. Now, the biggest difference is between the const and everything else. A constant that gets created cannot be changed once you give it a value. So we've created this const called z, and we set it to equal 4. At no point in the future can we change this constant z to anything other than 4. And we're only allowed to use it, so tap into its value elsewhere. Now, with var and let, we're able to change its value, but they behave slightly differently in relation to scope. So in terms of functions, for all three, they are all local. If you create a variable using var, let, or const inside a function, they all are local variables. They can only be used inside the function. But if you create any three of these types of variables outside the function, then they are all global variables and they have global scope. They can be accessed and used anywhere inside the file. Now, the third scenario is a little bit weird. If you create a variable inside an if or an else or a for or a while or anything that has a pair of curly braces, essentially, a block of code, then the var is a global and you can access this var x anywhere inside your file. But for let and const, they are variables. So that means that if you create a let or a const inside an if statement, then you can only use them inside the if statement. And this is true for loops, while loops, do while loops, any sort of other blocks of code that have a pair of curly braces. So this is something that's particular to JavaScript, because in a lot of other programming languages, if you create a variable using the var keyword, it will have local scope inside any sort of code block. So for loops, if, else statements, etc. Now, what I recommend as good practice is to try and avoid using this keyword var. Now, we've been using it up till this point because we weren't yet ready to talk about scope, but now that we understand how it works, it's much safer and more predictable to try and always use let or const whenever you can. There are very, very few scenarios where you will need to use the keyword var. And in fact, going forward, whenever you want to write the word var, replace it with let instead. Now, this again is a new concept, and JavaScript has a number of peculiarities that can be difficult for beginners to grasp. So in the resources section of this lesson, I've included some reading material and some background reading for you to really get to grips with this concept. And also, I recommend trying it out using let, const, and var inside the Chrome Developer Tools, inside the console, and trying to use and access and change these variables when they're created inside a function or outside a function or inside an if statement, so that you really understand what's going on yourself. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to be getting on and styling our to-do list to make it look the part instead of just working the part. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.